Welcome back for another episode of Errant Adventures. As always, I'm your game master and solo player, Steve Morrison. On this week's episode, we take our second faction turn as the politics of Heartvale continue to heat up. Find out what happens on episode 26, Arms and Influence. Alright, the time has come for yet another faction turn in Heartvale. So, after last episode's relative conclusion of the contract to search for the Shade who disappeared on the way to Valewater, it is time to return to our faction turn and see what happens with the various factions in the city. So as a quick refresher, I've got 6 factions here. We've got the Crest, we have the Vidala family, we have the Shade, the Drift, the Kingsword, or the Royal Dispatch Company, and the Council of 12 as represented in the person of Lord DeSoto. Each of these factions is going to have an opportunity to take a turn, and we are going to use the things that we've learned in the last few episodes of Adventure to determine what some of those actions are going to be. So as we get into it, we're just going to start right off with initiative. So each of the factions is going to have a D8 associated with it. I'm going to roll for each in turn, and that will determine the initiative order. So I'm rolling the first one for the Crest, and I rolled a 6. It's a pretty good start. For the Vidala family, we've got a 1. For the Shade, I also have a 6, which is good since they're allies with the Crest. For the Drift, we have a 3. For the Royal Dispatch Company, a 4. And for Lord DeSoto, a 2. Okay, so that means that the Crest and the Shade have the opportunity to act first. Which of them is going to act first? I'm going to roll a d6. So 1 to 3 will be the Crest, 4 to 6 will be the Shade. It's a 6, so the Shade are going to act first in this faction turn. So at the start of the faction turn, the faction earns treasure equal to half their wealth plus a quarter of their combined force and cunning, the total being rounded up. Okay, so the Shade have a wealth of 3, and their cunning and force is 6 total. So 6 quartered is going to be 1.5, so we're going to round that up to 2, which means they're going to gain 5 treasure. They had 3 at the end of last faction turn, so that's going to take them up to 8 treasure. Alright, so that's going to give them plenty of stuff to use. Now the faction then has to pay any upkeep required by individual assets, but none of their assets have any sort of upkeep cost. And let's talk about what the assets are for the Shade. So there are Vigilant Agents, which allow for a constant flow of observation that runs back to the faction from these watchful counterintelligence agents. This basically lets them keep an eye on stealth units that are moving around in the city around them. So that is potentially going to be useful. We also, last faction turn, had them recruit a group of petty seers, and they actually helped us with the crest and alerting Captain Netheridge to the ambush of his crest in the forest. And so they were able to send reinforcements out and subsequently destroy the Stone Thrower camp because of those petty seers. And then the Shade also have an arcane laboratory. Basically, it boosts up their magical status. So the Shade have these 3 assets, and they have a tag of concealed. All assets the faction purchase enter play with the stealth quality, which is super useful for a group of spooks. So like I mentioned, they don't have any upkeep to pay, and there aren't really any special attributes that are going to be triggered at the moment. So we are going to move on to the faction action. And there are multiple choices that we can make for this faction turn action. So they can attack another faction, they can move an asset, they can repair an asset, they can expand their influence, they can create an asset, they can hide an asset, and they can sell an asset. Now, last time we created the Petty Seers because I had the thought that they were going to use those seers to try and divine where the Vidala family had escaped to. And I don't know if they have figured that out yet, if that information has come through for them. So looking at the Petty Seers, there's nothing specific in there about them being able to peer into the veil and detect another faction. So what I'm going to do is I am going to go ahead and actually ask the fate chart from Mythic, and I'm going to set the chaos factor at 7, because I think with the tension between DeSoto and the Crest, with the revelation that Ephraim Fellheart has it out for at least one shade and possibly the Crest now as well, there's a lot of chaos here in the city. So I'm going to set the chaos rank at 7 for this faction turn, and then we are going to ask the fate chart. Are the Seers able to detect the Vidala presence in Davenar? I would say that it was going to be no way that they would detect that, except they have this new intelligence from Pano Tukio that the Kingsword operative that the Shade was looking for came from Davenar. And so I think that that gives them a little bit more fuel to work with. So I'm going to ask the question. I'm going to say it's very unlikely that they were able to detect the Vidala presence in Davenar. 55, which is a no. So the Shade Seers are not able to detect the Vidala quite yet in Davenar. And so because of that, I was initially going to have them create an asset to basically make an assassin to send out into the world, but I'm not going to do that in this case. So for this turn, I'm going to have the Shade move their assets. So when you move your assets, one or more assets are moved up to 1 turn's worth of movement each. The receiving location must not have the ability or indication to forbid the asset from operating there. Subtle and stealth assets ignore this limit. If an asset loses the subtle or stealth qualities while in a hostile location, they must use this action to retreat to safety within 1 turn, or they will take half of their maximum hit points and damage at the start of the next turn, rounded up. Okay, so all of the Shade's assets right now are in North Howl. And so I think we are going to move the Shade's Vigilant Agents into the North Scales, because I think they're starting to poke around for the Kingsword operatives, knowing that the Kingsword operative returned from Davenar and possibly could have some information, and that then Ephraim Fellheart commanded these stone throwers to attack and murder one of their Shades. So the Shade is going to start making moves against the Kingsword. The Petty Seers, I think, are going to move into the South Howl. They are headed towards the South Scales, but they can only move 1 area away. So they're going to move into the South Howl, and they are on their way, I think, to actually join the Crest and try to hone in on the Vidala. So that is the end of the faction action. Both of those assets are stealthed, which means that they can sort of sneak around. And we're going to end this by checking to see if the faction has completed its goal. The goal of the Shade is to root out the enemy. They have not completed that yet. So we are going to move on to the next faction, and that's going to be the Crest. Okay, so once again, we're going to earn some treasure. So the Crest have a wealth of 2, and then they have a combined cunning and force of 7. So 7 divided by 4 is going to be 1 and change, so we're going to round that up to 2. And 2 wealth is going to give them 4 treasure, which is going to take them up to 6 treasure. Now, the Crest have 2 assets. They have Informers, which are currently around in the South Howl, I think asking around about Lord DeSoto, trying to garner some information there. And then they also have stealthed infantry. So we're going to keep both of those there. And it makes sense to me that the Crest would try to continue recruiting more soldiers. So let's go ahead and take a look at our force assets and see what we can buy. So we have 6 treasure, and we could buy some more infantry. We could hire a guerrilla populace. That's interesting. Could hire some thugs, some local guards. They could pay off some local guards. Oh, we could hire some scouts or a reserve corps. So let's look at scouts. Long-range scouts and reconnaissance experts work for the faction, able to venture deep into hostile territory. Or we could hire some reserve corps, retired military personnel, rear-line troops. No, I don't think that's right. So I think I'm going to hire more infantry. This is going to represent the continued recruitment of forces for the Crest. That is going to tap out their treasure, but we are going to have more infantry located around the Crow's Nest. And I think that makes sense because, you know, we've sent out some into the surrounding area in Valewater. So we are going to spend all of our treasure to hire some infantry, because I think the thugs is maybe a little too weak, and I think scouts and the reserve corps are just not quite the right fit for what the Crest are currently doing. So they are increasing the Crest's numbers. They've spent their coin. I don't think they need to do anything with their informers in this moment because there aren't any stealth assets for them to try to find. And so we are then going to, I think, ask the question, have they increased the Crest's numbers enough? And I'm going to say it's pretty much impossible that they have increased the Crest's numbers enough. But we'll ask the fate chart. Chaos, rank of 7. 35. No, they have not increased them enough, so they have not fulfilled that faction goal, and therefore have not gained any experience for that. But they have now 2 units of infantry that will be very useful, I think, before this faction turn ends. So that is it for the Crest, which means we are now going to go to the Royal Dispatch Company. Last faction turn, the Royal Dispatch Company went ahead and built a manufactory, and I viewed that as being an extension of their creative endeavors, of these individuals who are churning out plays and churning out various statements and things that the Kingsword Criers go out and use to influence public opinion. And so they've done that thing here in the city, and they have that opportunity. So I think it's time for them to start making some moves. Now, we are going to, once again, start with treasure. So they have a wealth of 6. And they have a cunning and force of 7, so that is going to garner them 8 treasure. They had 4 left over, so they're going to be at 12 treasure. So they've got a lot to play with. And then, let's see, we are going to take a look at our special abilities. We've got pleaders, which are individuals, lawyers, skalds, law speakers, sage, elders, all of those things. They are able to turn a local society's laws against the enemies of the faction. Now, I think because of where we ended last episode, Ephron Fellheart, thanks to Gimbal, knows that his stone throwers have been wiped out by the crest. And so I think there is definitely a measure of enmity between him and the crest now. Whether or not that is going to come out immediately is a little questionable. But we have some options here because the Royal Dispatch Company has a number of assets. They are a medium-sized faction, whereas the Crest and the Shade are both small factions. So they have more resources, more power, at least when it comes to assets and wealth. So there's a Spy Master who is sort of running things behind the scenes. There are Useful Idiots, which is a cool asset that allows them to sacrifice that when another faction attacks one of their bases of influence. We have a trade company, which allows them to exchange hit points of the company for treasure. We have the pleaders, like I mentioned, and then we have the manufactory. And once per turn, as a free action, the asset's owners may roll 1d6. On a 1 point of treasure is lost. On a 2 to 5, 1 point is gained, and on a 6, 2 points are gained. So I've got 12 treasure. I'm going to go ahead and use that asset for this turn and roll a d6 and see what happens. I rolled a 2, so they are going to churn out some things and gain 1 treasure. So that's going to take them up to 13 treasure. Now, I'm tempted to make another asset, but I feel like I need to move some things into place here. And I think my biggest question is, what can the Spy Master do? So the Spy Master is a veteran operative who runs a counterintelligence bureau in the area and formulates offensive schemes for the faction. And what that looks like is they are subtle. They're able to move in and out of places that other assets might not be able to. And with their cunning, they're able to manipulate and influence perception towards another faction. So I think for this turn, we are going to take the move asset action for the Royal Dispatch Company. And the Kingsword Pleaders are going to move from the South Howl to the South Scales. And they're going to prepare to unleash a barrage of words against the crest to effectively try to turn public opinion against this mercenary company. But they can't do that this time. So on the next faction turn, they should be able to unleash that attack against the crest. Now, their Useful Idiots are in the grasp, but they're also going to move into the South Scales. It's getting a little crowded in the South Scales as they are making their way towards the North Scales, but they have to move through the South in order to get there. And I think because they have the ability to sacrifice themselves, if another asset within 1 turn's move of the Useful Idiots is struck by an attack. Okay, yeah, perfect. So I'm going to leave them there because that leaves them in range of all of the other assets. So if any of the Kingsword assets come under attack, the Useful Idiots can be sacrificed to save that particular asset. So they are going to move into the South Scales. They're going to hang out there for this turn, and that is going to be the end of the Kingsword faction turn. Their goal is to spend wealth in order to gain experience. They've already spent 8 wealth at the moment, and they have not completed that goal, so that is it for the Kingsword. Next up is the Drift. So the Drift have a wealth of 3 and a combined cunning and force of 10. So 10 divided by 4 is going to be 2 and change. So that's going to round up to 3, and 3 wealth is going to give them 6 treasure, which will take them up to 12 treasure. Now, the Drift have smugglers, so as a free action once per turn, the smugglers can move any allied wealth or cunning. Don't need that at the moment. They have interrupted logistics, which means non-stealth hostile units cannot enter the same location as the interrupted logistics asset without paying treasure. And that is located in Taimor's Bones, in the Tame, the docks of Heartvale. So say the non-stealthed infantry of the Crest wanted to move into the Tame. If the Drift wanted to prevent them, if they considered them to be a hostile unit, they could prevent them from moving for a turn, and the Crest would have to pay 1d4's worth of treasure in order to complete that move. They also have military transport, which is a bunch of ships, and they have a worker mob. The roughest, most brutal laborers in service with the faction have been quietly organized to sternly discipline the enemies of the group. So last time, the smugglers moved from Taimor's Bones into the South Scales, and they are going to attempt for their action turn to expand their influence. So this represents the Drift trying to get more of a foothold in the actual city. Now, the Drift, remember, is this armada of free ships that are moored in the harbor of Heartvale. And they are this strange group of individuals who live under this constitution whereby the ships are loosely affiliated and the crews of those ships have the ability to vote in their captains. It's this very democratic and free society that is mostly made up of former sailors from Heartvale who, after completion of their necessary 3-year duty service in the Heartvale Navy, did not want to return to the strictures of the more class-based society of Heartvale and wanted to live free out on the water. And so they live out there on their ships, and they hire themselves out as escorts and transport to the various merchants of Heartvale. And for the most part, Heartvale's navy and government ignores them, and there's a sort of subtle peace between them. There's mutual benefit to having them located there. They're kind of a first line of defense if an attacking navy were to sail towards Heartvale. But also, I think there is some tension between them as well, because they represent a very different way of life than what the Ducks and the Council of 12 and the nobility of Heartvale view as their God's given right to rule this city. So I think the idea of them trying to expand their influence into the Scales, which is the market district of Heartvale, where so much wealth and money comes through, I think is a very, very dangerous thing. So we'll see how this turns out for them, but their faction turn action is going to be to expand influence. So the faction seeks to establish a new base of operations in a location. The faction must have at least one asset there already to make this attempt, and must spend 1 treasure for each hit point the new base of influence is to have. So we've got the smugglers already in the South Scales, and we have 12 treasure to play with. So to create a new base of influence with a maximum hit points of 10 treasure must be spent. Bases with high maximum hit point totals are harder to dislodge, but losing them also inflicts much more damage on the faction's own hit points. Once the base of influence is created, the owner makes a cunning versus cunning attribute check against every other faction that has at least 1 asset in the same location. Ooh, bad news for the Drift. If the other factions win the check, they are allowed to make an immediate attack against the new base of influence with whatever assets they have present in the location. The creating faction may attempt to block this action by defending with other assets present. If the base of influence survives this onslaught, it operates as normal and allows the faction to purchase new assets there with the create asset action. So with the number of assets that are in the south scales right now, it's kind of a bad idea for the drift to try and gain a foothold here. However, bad ideas are what make for good drama. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. How much are the drift investing in this base of operation? I'm going to ask the fate chart. And I think, again, we've got 12 treasure to play with. Are the drift investing all of their resources into building this base of operations? I'm going to say it is 50-50. I don't know that they would go all in on this. So chaos rank of 7, 50-50. 77 is a no. So they are not investing all of their resources into this. So I think because we've got 12 treasure, I'm going to go with they're spending 8 treasure on this base of influence, which is going to leave us with 4, which is not a bad amount of treasure to start with. This is going to be an 8 hit point base of influence. Let's go ahead and make a note of that. So this is in the south scales. And because they are starting this in a location that has assets from all of the other factions, we're going to walk down the line and see what each one thinks. So first of all, we have Crest infantry in this area, and I am going to quite easily say that they are not going to take an attack against the drift, because we already know that the Crest has worked with the drift, and we know that Captain Netheridge has been meeting with Steward Captain Auxilia of the drift, possibly about, making sure that the Crest has a way out of the city if things get tense. So I think they are going to forego any sort of attack against the drift, trying to build a new set of operations here. Now, I said every faction has assets here, but the Shade don't and the Vidala don't, so we can go ahead and ignore them. But both the DeSoto and the Kingsword have assets here, and they are going to definitely take action. I don't think either the Kingsword or the DeSoto have any interest in the drift expanding their influence into the scales. Now, we have to make a cunning versus cunning attribute check against the other factions. And based on what it says here, it makes it sound like I should make that against all of the factions. But since I've already decided that the Crest are foregoing the attack, I'm going to, for simplicity's sake, not even worry about that. So our cunning for the drift is 6. So they've got a really strong cunning. And then our cunning for the Kingswords, we'll start with them, is 5. And it's going to be a D10 roll for each of them. And then we are going to see what happens. Oh, okay. So I've got a 13 on the drift roll, and we have a 14 with the Kingsword roll. So the Kingsword are successfully able to defeat the drift on this cunning attack, and that means that they are able to make an immediate attack against the new base of influence with whatever assets they have present. So let's go ahead and see what we've got here. We've got the Pleaders and the Useful Idiots, both in the South Howl. The Useful Idiots don't have an attack, so it's going to be the Pleaders. So for this attack, the Pleaders are going to make a cunning versus a wealth attack. And I think the drift are going to try and resist that with their smugglers. So their smugglers don't have a counterattack, but they can interpose themselves in the fight. So we're going to go ahead and once again roll 2d10, and we're going to roll plus cunning for the pleaders. So we know that the Kingsword have a cunning of 5, and it's going to go up against the wealth of the drift, which is plus 3. So not great. Here we go. Ooh, very bad. So we got a 14 again on the Kingsword and a 5 for the drift. So they fail to fend off the pleaders. So that is going to deal 2d4s worth of damage to the smugglers. So that is 3, and 3 is 6 points of damage, and the smugglers probably don't have that much health. They have 4 hit points. Okay, so what that means to me is I think this building in the South Scales where the drift are starting to set up shop, the Kingsword criers begin talking about this shop and saying bad things about it and calling it out as a representation of outsiders, interlopers coming into the city and stealing good business space from other members of Heartvale, other citizens of Heartvale, and leaving them without the opportunity to start their own businesses. And this kind of turns some of the public perception against them. And a little bit of a mob gathers up and starts to throw rocks and other things at the building. And the smugglers have to basically reveal themselves in order to protect the storefront from getting destroyed. But they are successful in keeping the mob from tearing down this new front for the drift. However, in so doing, they can't exactly act as smugglers anymore because the people of the city know that they work for the drift. So that is going to remove that asset from play. So we're going to go ahead and get rid of those smugglers. And unfortunately for the drift, that is not the end of it. So the Kingsword have done their work, but now the DeSoto are going to act as well. So once again, we're going to do a cunning versus cunning on this as they attempt to go ahead and expand their influence. Cunning for the drift is 6. Cunning for DeSoto is 3. So they got a good chance here. Ooh, all right. So we got an 8 for the drift and a 4 for the DeSoto, which means that they are able to fend off any advances from the DeSoto assets, which is actually really good for the drift because Lord DeSoto has both armed guards and hired friends in that area, and either one of those could have done some pretty detrimental harm to that 8 hit point base of influence. That is it for the assets that are present in that area. And so the drift are successfully able to create this storefront, this location in the South Scales that is a new base of operations for them, and we'll figure out the details on what that is later. Maybe one of our heroes will visit it at some point. So that is going to end their turn, and we now move to the Council of 12. So Lord DeSoto is going to earn some treasure here. So Lord DeSoto's wealth is 6 plus 8. The cunning and force combined is 8. So that's going to be 2. So 6 and 2 is 8 total treasure on top of the 6 treasure they have, which is 14 total. So they've got some stuff to play with here. No upkeep is required here. And let's take a look at our assets. So they have hired friends, which allows them to spend treasure and grant a wealth asset within 1 turn's movement range the subtle quality. This quality will remain regardless of the wealth asset's movement until the hired friends are destroyed or they use this ability again. They have a Vanguard unit, which is guarding the Duxit, where Lord DeSoto has his office. They have a Merchant Prince, which represents Lord DeSoto himself, and this allows him to take some health damage and be able to purchase a new asset for a little bit less treasure. And then they also have Informers, which we created last time. They can try to have them look for stealth assets. And then they have Armed Guards. These are hired guards that serve the faction. So we're going to do a couple things. First of all, the Informers are going to attempt to uncover the hidden infantry of the crest. So this is going to require 1 treasure spent, which is not a problem for Lord DeSoto. And this is going to be a cunning versus cunning attack. There's not going to be any counter damage to this, but if they are successful, they're going to reveal the stealthed infantry. So this is going to be 3 cunning for the Lord DeSoto and 3 cunning for the crest. So we've got 7 for Lord DeSoto and 4 for the crest, which means they successfully win the contest and the stealthed infantry are now revealed. I think this is represented by news of the crest in Valewater. And Lord DeSoto realizes that those who are responsible for the death of his nephew, Bacchio de Fara, have escaped the city. And I think because of that, we're going to ask the fate chart this question, and I think it's going to be very likely. Does Lord DeSoto take out his frustration on those crest who are still within Heartvale? Does he attack the Crow's Nest? I think it's very likely. Chaos rank of 7. 82 in this case is a yes. Yes, he is going to attack. So the faction nominates 1 or more assets to attack the enemy in their locations. In each location, the defender chooses which of the assets present will meet the attack. Thus, if a unit of infantry attacks in a location where there is an enemy base of influence, informers, and idealistic thugs, the defender could decide to use idealistic thugs to defend against the attack. The attacker makes an attribute check based on the attack of the acting asset. Thus, the infantry would roll force versus force. On a success, the defending asset takes damage equal to the attack asset's attack score, or 1d8 in the case of infantry. On a failure, the attacking asset takes damage equal to the defending asset's counterattack score, or 1d6 in the case of the idealistic thugs in this example. If the damage done to an asset reduces it to 0, it is destroyed. The same asset may be used to defend against multiple attacks, provided it can survive the onslaught. Damage done to a base of influence is also done directly to the faction's hit points. Okay, so right now, we have the armed guards of Lord DeSoto attacking the crest base. I think they... Are they attacking the base or are they attacking the infantry directly? I feel as though we didn't get an exceptional yes on the question of whether or not DeSoto was attacking, so I think it's actually just going to be the armed guards versus the infantry. There's a skirmish in the streets. The Crest are returning to the Crow's Nest from some job, and they are intercepted by DeSoto's armed guards. There's a little bit of a confrontation in the streets, and because I think Iron Gull, who is a steadying influence in and amongst the rank and file, because he's not in the city, things are a little bit more on edge. And so these two groups meet, and then they are going to fight. And so this is going to be the armed guards of Lord DeSoto versus the infantry of the crest. So our armed guards are going to do a wealth versus force attack. So this is going to pit DeSoto's wealth, which is 6, versus the crest's force of 4. Now, the crest are special because they have a faction tag called Martial. The faction is profoundly devoted to war. It rolls an extra die for all force attribute checks. Force must always be its highest attribute, which it is. It's a 4, their cunning is 3, and their wealth is 2. So the crest are going to roll 2d10 on this, and DeSoto only gets 1 d10. Oh, bad luck for the crest. I rolled 2 2s on the 2d10, so that is going to be a total of 6. And I rolled a 6 plus 6, which is a 12 for the DeSoto guards. So that is going to inflict 1d3 points of damage to the infantry. That is 2 points of damage. The infantry has 6 hit points, so that takes them down to 4 hit points. I think what that means is that there's this skirmish in the streets, but it is not very lethal. I don't think anybody dies from it. I think it's bloody. There are some injuries, and I think the crest actually end up getting a little bit of the worst of it. Fortunately, I think they're close enough to the crow's nest that maybe Saga passing by is able to intervene and stop the fighting, along with maybe some of the City Watch who were passing by. And so the fight is short and bloody, but it is not deadly. So DeSoto has successfully attacked the crest, and his faction goal is to eliminate a target. He has not completed that task, but he is on the way, and he's got another turn in which to do so. So that is going to end DeSoto's turn, and that leaves us only with the Vidala family. So the Vidala have a wealth of 4 and a cunning and force combined of 4, so they're going to gain 5 treasure. That is going to take them up to 6 treasure total, and they are outside of the city, so things are a little bit different for them. They are in Davenar. In our last turn with them, they created a blackmail asset in Davenar after they gained this hold over these priests in this temple in Davenar. And so I think they've got a choice here. I think they have to choose between whether or not they're expanding their influence or they're trying to create another asset. I think because of this like rotting sickness and that it may be connected to the worshippers of Vargosh and that scene that we had of them in the temple where they've basically taken over that temple, I am going to go ahead and do the expand influence. So they have 6 treasure. I think they are going to spend all of that treasure to try and make this a 6 hit point temple. And I am going to do a cunning versus cunning. Now here's the thing. None of the factions that we have in play right now are in Davenar. So I think I'm going to arbitrarily give the Davenar as a whole a cunning score of 4. And I'm going to make this cunning roll versus Davenar, and that is going to determine if Davenar is able to resist in some way this growth of Vargosh's influence within the heart of their city. So the Vidala family have a cunning of 3 versus a cunning of 4 from the city. And they are able to resist. So we got a 6 on the dice for the Vidala family and an 11 on the dice for Davenar. So they are able to resist, which means they can make an attack. I think there are probably just guards. I think it's just going to be the local guard asset, which is going to be force versus force. And I think the guards in Davenar, their force is going to be a 5. And the Vidala only have a force of 1. So this is probably going to go pretty poorly for them. Yes, so a 9 on the dice for Davenar, a 7 on the dice for the Vidala, and that is going to inflict 1d3 plus 1 point of damage, which is 3 plus 1 would be 4 damage. Now, I don't think they have any assets in that area that they can use. Yeah, the blackmail just means that the enemy can only roll 1 die, even if they have assets that allow them to roll more. So I don't think the Vidala have any way of fighting against this, and that is going to deal 4 hit points of damage, and that is going to hurt them. It's going to take the temple down to 2. I think what that means is there are quarantine procedures in progress, and there are a few members of that priesthood who have been corrupted by the Vidala, who have since been either killed or captured by the city. It has weakened the forces that the Vidala have, and it's going to take their hit points down to 7, because I think that was an attack against that base of influence, which all attacks against bases of influence go to the hit points of the faction. So the faction there ends at 7 hit points. They have built their temple. They now have this thing. They survived these attacks against them by Davenar, and they now have a foothold there, but they are certainly in a worse position than they were. That ends the faction turn. And all of the leaders of these various factions are continuing to plot and plan and attempt to determine how best they can win in this game of politics in the city of Heartvale and beyond. Thanks for listening to Errant Adventures, and thanks so much to Syrinscape for the lovely ambient sounds and music throughout the episode. If you enjoyed the show, please tell anyone and everyone in your life about it. And if you haven't already, please rate and review the show on your favorite podcast app. It really does help others find me. If you want to interact with me, my handle on Instagram and Twitter is @ErrantSoloPod, or you can email me at errantsolopod@gmail.com. I also post short fiction and campaign-related materials on my website, errantadventurespod.com. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time.